All right, we're going to start up again. So what we saw in the last session was essentially the move. What I told you about was where anthropology came into health policy and systems research. There was no deliberate marriage there. It was simply that anthropologists who had been working on medical systems or health systems from different perspectives, they started to work more in public health or schools of public health, and then there was a potential recognized that actually social scientists, the concepts of studying interactions at the micro level could be very helpful in understanding health systems software, which was, as you remember, a concept that was introduced in health systems thinking and frameworks around 2010, 2012. So we also said that there were two branches of medical anthropology, one that was very focused on medical systems as cultural systems, and the other one focused on medical systems as political and economic systems. And they had very different implications for understanding people's behavior within the system. Yeah, with the one, culturalist approach has tended to focus more on patients or people who are afflicted by a certain condition, versus the political economy branch, which focuses more on power relations within biomedicine and how it affects provider behavior. Okay, then I suggested that regardless of what camp you sit in, it's useful to think about relational aspects of health systems and the fact that we need to take into account what do certain types of knowledge mean to certain people, and to not just accept that this is the be all and end all, this is authoritative knowledge. So even thinking about a policy or a new piece of scientific evidence that comes in, it's going to mean different things to different people. The second thing we said is to focus on practice. What is it that people do in the system? How do they navigate the system? How do providers navigate the constraints of their working environments? And the third thing we said is that we want to focus on things so that navigation includes considerations of time and space. And then the third thing we said is we focus on social relations. And there's ways of recognizing the embeddedness of power and social relations in every interaction. Okay, good. So now you might be saying, okay, this is all very nice, thank you very much, but how do we actually go about doing this? What kinds of approaches can we use? And so I'm going to be speaking to you about the use of ethnographic approaches. And you may be more familiar with qualitative approaches, and you may say, well, what's the difference? Is that the same? If I do a couple of interviews, am I doing ethnography? What do you think? No. Why do you think no?
Maybe it relates more to finding out about the context of the person rather than just that one going off a short interaction. We want to know about the context and in which the person is situated and how it influences their behavior. So we even look at their behavior and small habits to like draw a picture about.
Okay, very good. So you have an idea about context. Why is it difficult to get context from an interview, a one-off interview? Okay, let's say you're interviewing mothers about child feeding practices. Okay, you're a nutritionist, but you're actually interested in what influences, does gender play a role in how mothers decide, how to feed their children, or when and what to feed them? What happens in an interview? Yeah, you might get something about context depending on how well you conduct the interview, but in fact, ascertaining the contextual influences on feeding practices you're probably better off if you have a chance to spend some time in households and actually observe what's going on. Yeah? So when the people are sitting around eating, do they notice, you start to notice, oh, the boy child is getting a lot more on their plate, or they're getting some preferential treatment in terms of whatever it is, sweet things or whatever, okay? So that's just a little tiny example, but context is very important. So what do we mean by ethnography? We generally mean a methodology, a methodological approach, which encompasses a way of thinking, a paradigm, and an approach to field work. But it is also simultaneously known as the written product. So you can say, I'm conducting an ethnography, but the product of the work that I did over the last 4 years resulted in an ethnography. So ethnography is also the product. Yeah. Study and systematic recording of human cultures also. It is also a descriptive work that's produced from this research. So what's important is to note here that when we talk about ethnography, we're talking about methodology. And methodology does not equal methods, yeah? So this is why we went kind of systematically through those 8 steps. And we said that methodology is part of the research paradigm. It is, you know, the aspect of how you're going to source and gather the knowledge that you are trying to ascertain about a topic. So methodology is sometimes a research paradigm, but it's part of the research paradigm. It's informed by the epistemology and the theory. And often there's a confusion of ethnographic and qualitative when you describe methods. And many times I see papers that say, we used ethnographic methods to do some observations. And a colleague of mine a long time ago, Wenzel Geisler, he said, mixing up ethnography with specific methods is like reducing cardiology to using a stethoscope. Okay, so it's not the tool, it is the whole mindset and the whole approach. So one of the most important things that characterizes ethnography is that you spend a certain amount of time in a field setting. And in the olden days, I told you about pre-1960s, when anthropologists had the luxury of spending some year or years somewhere in a remote village or rural setting or wherever. Fieldwork was an extensive period of time where they really got to learn the language, they immersed themselves, they were able to take part in daily life of the people that they were working with or studying. But it was a kind of pretty much a top-down. It was the researcher observing and kind of reproducing an ethnography about these people. Nowadays, we still do field work, but it is generally much shorter because of time constraints, but also because it is ethically and practically no longer feasible. So sometimes, what do we mean by the field? Sometimes we mean a geographic place, yeah? Which means I am doing my field work in, you know, some small part of southern Karnataka, okay? It's located geographically. Sometimes it's an institution or an organization. So the field could be, and I think, for example, many of your topics are making reference to national level or even international level guidelines. Your place of fieldwork could be the WHO, could be the field, okay? In other words, your universe of interest is an institutional site rather than a geographic site. What does that mean with respect to geography and accessibility? Let's say I'm focusing on WHO and the influence of WHO on Indian PPM. If my field work, if I want to spend some field, if I want to consider the WHO my field, what does it potentially mean for where I'm situated? Am I going to be stuck in Geneva, all of my field work? No. So where else could I be? Could be in the regional office, right? the South, whatever it's called, CRO, regional WHO office in Delhi. You could spend some time online. So your field site becomes a movable site, right? It could be a physical structure, okay? So if you say, I'm really interested in the role of religious institutions in supporting mental health, okay? And I want to conduct research on churches. And my field site, because I have 6 months' time, I am going to, and I myself am going to do some participant observation. Without being disingenuous, I'm somebody who's going to attend and be part of this congregation of the church, because I want to experience firsthand what this church has come to mean for the people of the community in terms of different kinds of support and care, different types of mental solace, refuge, etc. Okay? So the church, now you might say, that's kind of an institution and it's a physical structure. But for the purposes of this example, let's just assume that in our case we're thinking about the physical structure. I'm going to go and spend time in the church. It could also be a social space, right? So you could be an ethnographer. I did some interesting work in China on stroke rehabilitation. And even though most of our research was closely governed or dictated by what the Chinese colleagues wanted me to do, which was to focus on different kinds of hospitals and hospital care, as I was walking every day, because there it is possible still to walk, as in it's possible to walk to, from the hotel to the institution. It's easier. There's a sort of pathways that take you along a river in a very, very busy city. So there's a lot of emphasis on creating pathways and walkways and spaces. I noticed something phenomenal, which was that there were lots of parks, and the parks were full of elderly people. And what were they doing? Like you would find here, 5 a.m., you go to a park, you're going to find people walking. But there, they were doing Tai Chi, they were singing opera, they were painting with water calligraphy on the ground, they were doing aerobics classes. It was unbelievable, the level of activity, physical activity for the elderly. So I thought, I would love to shift this whole ethnography from these quite rigid bureaucratic units to understanding the whole mentality and the culture around physical activity among what presumably is a quite well-off elderly. Yeah? But the social space there would become these parks. It's another field site. And you can imagine a project designed around that, which looks at the park as a thing. The other thing is a community. And that community is also, as Solomon pointed out, what constitutes a community differs. You can also tie the community to a geographic space, but a community could be an online community. So imagine you're interested in understanding the relevance of social media groups to support people who have long COVID. So your community is not a physical one that you're going to be able to interact with in physical terms, but it's an online community. Okay, so we were planning some work which unfortunately didn't get funded, which was to work with patient networks from the French side and the Dutch side of Belgium, and our mode of entry was going to be through social media. So that was a community. They defined themselves as the Long COVID Patients Association because they felt very wronged by the government that didn't take them seriously. A culture or a subculture can also be a field, all right? So sometimes you say there's certain types of cultures that emerge around sports. Yeah, so in California, surfer culture is a big thing. It's all the people that do, kind of surfing, board surfing. Skater culture. I'm just thinking sports now. But there's other kinds of cultures. There's cultures around specific activities, leisure activities. But there's also things that are subcultures that might be associated with an identity, a social identity that is tied to, a marginal identity, a sexual minority, or a an ethnic minority, or something that is defined simply by virtue of a common shared interest that becomes so developed in terms of practices and how you think about things that it becomes a culture. Okay, so in terms of health and medicine, I've already given you a clue. I've said that WHO could be your field site. What do you think counts as being in the field? So if you're going to do a health systems and policy piece of work, what could be the field for you? Now, reflecting on your topics, do you have to go inside the health system, or what else might be possible field sites for you? Any thoughts?
Okay, both organization and this community.
Say it again?
We can take organization, community.
Yeah. Yeah. You could have the organization, an organizational level of the field. You could have a specific community. But let's dig a bit deeper. What do you mean here by community? What are relevant communities? You don't have to use your examples, but Sakshi, Gayatri?
Relevant to our topic, we are looking into road traffic accidents. So a community for me, an important part of the research could be bystander community. So how their responses affect care. So that's an important part. Or even the caregiver community of the patient side. So that's also a community for me that becomes a field of research.
Okay. I think you have to be careful that you as a researcher don't define the community. Yeah? If the bystanders have nothing to do with each other, they don't form a community. Okay? So always take account of that. If, for example, there's a group of people who feel that they were unjustly treated by the hospital and they form an association because they want to mutually support each other, that is a potential community. Yeah? But be wary of labeling things a community when there is no self-identified thing, okay? So other things that could be fields, okay? Do you think, for example, a laboratory could be a field site for health systems work? Why do you think a laboratory could be? Or those of you who think yes, it could be?
It depends on whether it's sentinel or it's a peripheral activity. We can take it as a field where they collect the samples and all.
Is that true? Does the laboratory have to be peripheral in order to be a field site? Or could I look at a central laboratory? What would be my interest? Okay, putting your social science hats on now. Why might my laboratory become a field site? Yeah?
It's the whole system and the people involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, it's a system in and of itself. A laboratory system, a pharmaceutical system, the outpatient, the waiting, I said the waiting room is a system by itself. They're all governed by certain rules, right? And sometimes those rules are implemented in ways that follow a particular schema, an algorithm, and sometimes they're not. So there is a very famous ethnography called the social, I forgot what it's called, I think it's called Laboratory Life, the social construction of laboratory facts. And it basically studies very famous labs like the Pasteur lab, the Pasteur Institute, and it looks at the social dynamics of how people negotiate contested meanings of evidence that's produced in a lab. But there's also interesting studies about the transfer of knowledge from the slide to conveying it to people and what happens in contexts of uncertainty. So the laboratory and the system of laboratory, the social relations within the laboratory, the evidence, the temporal, the spatial, all those aspects, the relationships between senior versus junior lab technicians becomes a subject in and of itself, whereby the laboratory is your field site. So next time you pass the little lab here, don't forget to peer in and say, I don't think they'll be so happy, but maybe you could do some study there. Okay. Okay. Other things, not just laboratories, but as I said, pharmacies have a subsystem, and other parts of the structure of the health system, but community health worker programs, obviously we've talked about different kinds of health worker programs, different types of associations, those all could be field sites. So let's talk about field work. Generally, we all think of ourselves as doing field work, even if you do a survey. But classically speaking, there's a difference between data collection and field work. So often data collection involves a short, it's a one-off presence. You pile in, there's a team of 5 of you, you do your survey, it's over in 2 weeks, yeah? Whereas in field work, it implies a longer continuous presence in the field. In short-term data collection, the information is usually collected through formal methods, yeah? So in other words, you have protocols, you've got your survey tool, you have your topic guides, you have a plan, yeah? In field work, yes, you're going to use formal methods, but a lot of what you collect is through informal conversations and through observations. Because you're spending a lot of time there, you're going to get a lot of information about the context simply by noting what's happening around you. In the data collection, usually the reality is pre-existing, so the researcher is detached from the subject in the field. Okay, they don't have to be a positivist, but in general, they're not immersing themselves in the field. They're not becoming one of the field when they enter it. You're not going to enter the lab and become a lab technician. You're not immersing yourself like that. Okay. In field work, the reality that you describe is acknowledged to be a product of your engagement and your positioning within the field. So it's very different if a lab technician writes that ethnography based on 6 months spent in XYZ lab observing things versus somebody who goes in for a couple of weeks, conducts some interviews, does a survey, and is essentially assessing the quality of the laboratory systems. It's a very different story. You could still use interviews, but the idea is that you've got a set of pre-existing data collection instruments, and you're going to capture specific aspects of that reality. Whereas the lab technician who goes there, spends 6 months, gets friendly with or not friendly with the team, but is really immersed in this. They're really doing something called participant observation. They're going to get quite a different picture of, and maybe their focus is also quite different. They're not really interested in quality of the lab. They're interested in how dynamics of the lab setting allow certain types of information to flow in certain ways. In data collection, usually the fixed accounts are, the analysis is fixed and the account is reproducible. Okay, so generally, especially for positivist research, if you have existing tools, then one person from each of the tables should be able to do the same research. Yeah? Versus field work, it's a narrative analysis. It depends so much on you and your positioning in the field that it's not reproducible. So we said that in classical anthropology, often people went and they spent a long time, and now that's no longer so much the case. Today, it involves less time and higher costs. If I want to hire somebody who's capable of doing really good field work, as opposed to conducting a survey, it costs a lot more money because you're going to ask them to get out of their home space. They're going to move. They're going to stay in the community, and they're going to kind of immerse themselves for a while. But it is often short term. Yeah, it's short term, so it's more intensive. There has been development of rapid methods, rapid anthropological methods. They were very popular in the 70s and 80s. And the idea was to say that, look, if you can't immerse yourself totally, like I was saying to you, clinic observations or clinic ethnography, even if I can't spend a week or a month or half a year in a clinic to understand it fully, even doing 2 days in the clinic is going to give me more than just interviewing a clinic manager. Okay? So that excerpt you read clearly comes from somebody who's spent time observing the dynamics of that clinic. That probably that information wouldn't be had from a simple interview, right? Today, instead of trying to represent society in its totality, which is what the old style anthropologists did, fieldwork today is responding to a specific focus or a specific question. Often there's more than one researcher, and they might be trained in less structured or more structured methods. And often the fieldwork that you're doing today, the data collection that's involved in the fieldwork context, has practical ends. So very often the fieldwork that we're conducting is in the interests of, especially if you're an Hpsr researcher, you're usually trying to improve some aspect of the system, or you're aware that there's some problem. You're not just documenting it, right? But fundamentally, the idea of fieldwork is still acknowledging that it's a social exchange, yeah? And as soon as you enter the field and you spend some time there, you are having some kind of relationship or interactions. And so much of what you can do or what you're able to get as data is contingent on the relationship that you have. So one of the most important things that we need to think about when you start to do field work is your social interaction and your self-presentation. And that's critical to the success of your research project. The scope and the quality of the data you collect is really influenced by these relationships that you develop with people in the field. So you might say, oh, do you mean instrumental relationships? Do you mean like finding a gatekeeper who's going to help me access this place? It's not just the instrumental, it's the rapport you build each and every time you are interacting with somebody you want to gain some information from. It's the level of trust you build in the community that you're talking about, even with an online. You can imagine how wary they might be if you engage with an online group and you say, well, I don't actually have hemophilia or I don't actually have long COVID, but I'm interested in how people cope with it. Initially, the response might be back off, you know. You're not really part of this community. But if you explain why you're doing this research and that it's intended to support people in their position, maybe you'll be better off. Your position as a researcher, age, sex, ethnic group, caste, whatever, socioeconomic status, in relation to the position of the research participant, always be aware of that. So, you know, I think anybody with good social science training will know that when you approach the field, especially a field site that you're going to spend longer, you've got to adjust, you know, what you're wearing, how you behave, whether you march in and say, I'm Dr. So-and-so, versus saying, I'm a researcher, yeah? Even that small thing. Now, sometimes saying that I'm Dr. So-and-so is useful, because if I'm interviewing private providers and I go in saying, you know, I'm Little Miss Junior Researcher from X, the initial credibility is going to be difficult. So you have to say, I'm Dr. So-and-so, even though it might make you feel very, even, you know, sometimes you don't like to play the hierarchy card. But just to get in, sometimes it's required. And then you can explain that you're not there in your capacity as the doctor or the, you know, head of department or whatever it is. But on the whole, I think it's better to be humble and to be honest and try to establish the rapport, not by means of your status, but by means of your manner, yeah, your demeanor. You're seeking a common point. So wider power structures in society obviously mean that some people's views are more accepted and more frequently represented than others. And sometimes you can't get around that no matter how nice you are or how forthcoming you are. In fact, the nicer you are in some places, the lower down you are on the scale, because people just think this is a pushover. So if you walk in a very arrogant manner and sort of say, I'm here to collect information on blah, 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 somehow you're more respected than if you come in and you offer them sweets, right? So, okay. So that's at a surface level. But at a deeper level, when you are actually immersing yourself in the field for a longer period of time, and sometimes when you get funding, it means you're going to have recurrent interactions. What is very important is speaking the language. And a lot of anthropologists or people who are conducting ethnography now no longer speak the language of where they go, which is a real shame, because I say even if you can manage greetings, basic things in the local language, it can make such a difference. People can see that you're trying. Yeah, this morning I tried out some Marathi with the driver and he was absolutely thrilled. I could see the complete change in the shift. So I thought, okay, the next one I'm taking his life history, but not in Marathi, sadly. But learning how to do things the way they're done or not. So when we conducted fieldwork here so many years ago, it was over a period of 7 months in one community, which was geographically bounded. But we did things like participate as you're talking to a group of women and they're washing their clothes by the river. I mean, it seems a bit ridiculous to start washing clothes as well, but doing something that puts you kind of on the same level helps a lot. Sifting, I mean, in Africa, in West Africa, people spend a long time separating the grains, you know, the stones from the grains before they get into the mill and all that. So you sit there and you sift the grains. And they'll laugh at you because you're doing it wrong, but actually that's an entry point, yeah? So trying to do things the way they're done or messing up is kind of part of that. So you become part of the social field, you engage, you transform the field as you do so, and you document it, yeah? So that's part of ethnography. Now you might say, okay, this sounds very cozy, very rosy, but actually practically speaking, it's not so easy. Because you have to maintain a balance, right, between being an insider. On the one hand, you're trying to fit in, you're trying to understand things from people's perspective. And I'm talking not just about the work in a community, as in a remote area where you're trying to understand people's health practice. I'm also talking about the person who steps into the lab situation or the operating theater. You can only be an insider to an extent. Because if you go fully insider, you're no longer a researcher. But vice versa, if you're fully an observer, it's very difficult to have that social connection. So does the observer, when are they participant and when is the participant an observer? And there's always going to be a tension between the two. There's no way getting around it. So as long as you document it carefully and you note moments of, you know, awkwardness, conflict, silence, all those things that can occur, that can shape the quality of your data, I think it's very, very important. So I always had breakthroughs in whatever fieldwork I was doing. When I mastered, for example, the accent, you know, like even working in an English-speaking country, but a country, so I worked in, my very first piece of fieldwork many years ago was in the Caribbean. And it was working with banana farmers and looking at, it was looking at practices to improve the viability of avoiding erosion of basically banana farming, easy but unfortunately not great for the soil. So they were mixing trees and bananas. Anyway, long story short point. But so they speak a very interesting English. It's a patois and it's very heavily inflected by West Indian, sort of intonation, sing-song, etc. And I remember being really proud when I was able to sort of speak slightly in that way, and it didn't feel fake. It felt, you know, it felt like I was just fitting in. So there are lots of moments that you have if you spend longer in the field. I also remember working in Tanzania and on an island which was very famous for black magic. And it's second nature. Initially you come and everybody's telling you, oh, no, you know, don't do this, don't do that, because there's devils here and there's this, and you kind of are just reeling. And then after 6 months, you just say, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to sit under that mango tree because it's possessed by a certain type of devils, and you know, I'll break out into a rash, so I just avoid that tree. And it just becomes second nature, right? So it just happens. You start, and it's not just about sort of strange cultural practices, it's also about other settings. So I think the trick is to start observing familiar settings as unfamiliar, yeah? So look for those beliefs, practices, norms, even in a setting where you don't traditionally associate. You don't think of as a lab as having beliefs, practices, norms, or maybe the norms part, but you don't think of it as a place that is imbued with culture, but it is in a way, right? Anyway, so this tension between the participant observer is something that never goes away. Also the question about, are you known as a researcher? Because you might be saying to yourself, if you spend a longer period of time in a community and you're observing and your formal methods are now run out. So what strategy do you think you would use? Don't worry, we're going to get into this. We're going to do a whole session on this, but I'm just preparing you in advance, and I'm asking you about the situations where you're gathering information through informal contacts, informal observations, things that are not part of your official SOP. What do you do with that information? Anybody? Do you use it or do you not use it? Go ahead.
Ma'am, we can use it, and like before reporting it, we can priorly tell them that, you know, like this part of our interaction would be used, and take like not formal consent, but tell them that this will be used.
Okay. All right. So generally, I think you have to, whatever way you're going to use, because when you talk about doing field ethnographic field work, very often it is associated with a longer period in the field. It might not be 6 months, but it's definitely longer. So even if you go into a clinic and you say, I'm going to spend 3 days and do observations, you have to somehow convey to the staff and the people who are going to move through that clinic that there is going to be a researcher present in that clinic. So one way we did it is to organize 5 minutes during the staff meeting. And we would say, we're going to be here, we're going to do a series of formal things, which include interviews, observations, but we are also we're generally trying to understand how this clinic functions, okay? The other thing we could do is the work that we're doing in pharmacies at the moment in Belgium that I told you about, is we put posters in the pharmacies saying that currently you may notice 1 or 2 people who are not normally in this pharmacy. We are researchers, this is what we're doing. Yeah? So I think what's very important is you try your best to make people aware of the fact that there is a researcher, and you give them the chance, in case there is somebody who gets upset or wants to know more, you give them that you remain accessible to them. Okay. The other question is how much or what is known about the research. So sometimes you get in a situation where you are trying to do research about something that's sensitive. So let's say you were working in a field site, top level, and you're actually trying to understand conflicts across different kinds of, different political influences and how they're affecting the delayed implementation of a policy. You are not going to announce to them from the beginning that I'm looking into the conflicts, the delays, and the problems you're having there, right? You're going to have to stay neutral. But actually at heart, your research is about unpacking those conflicts that you know exist. So again, attention that you have to think about beforehand, yeah? And again, what are the limits of participation? So when we talk about participant observation, realistically, if you're doing research on whatever, alcohol consumption in young people, are you going to consume vast amounts of alcohol just to put yourself into that situation? Maybe, maybe not. Okay? All right, so you need to be explicit about who you are in the field. And in qualitative research, but particularly for ethnographic research, it's important to be reflexive, which means you take notes, which include not just notes about what you see and what you observe related to your topic, but how you feel about what you see. So it's the day-to-day trivia. It's little things that you observe that might not be part of your formal observations, but it's things that strike you as interesting. It's your emotions, okay? There are days where you're going to feel bored. You're going to feel, that things haven't been going very well. People are asking you what the point of this thing is. You're allowed to record that. You could record things that are surprising, where you make mistakes or you have doubts. And these are all reflections about how assumptions shape the research. Positionality is something different. So reflexivity is allowing you to reflect on things that are affecting the research and the course of research. And positionality is being very conscious about how your position as a medical doctor, as a scientist, as a woman, as somebody from a particular caste, is going to affect the interactions that you have. In a survey, nobody thinks about this stuff. They just assume it's a survey. Just go out there, do my survey. It is equally important because sometimes even conducting a survey is based on the initial rapport that the enumerator has with the participant. But you're being explicit about your position, your power, your hierarchy, your solidarity, or your control. So just like in a key informant interview, we think about our position, in ethnographic work, we're also thinking about our position. And we're thinking about the influence of our status on social relations in the field. Okay, so moving to what is it you're doing during ethnographic work. In contrast to data collection, where you're using some tools, formal tools, a lot of ethnographic work is just about taking field notes. And it's daily record of observations and experience. It's capturing things like terminology, quotes, some interesting quotes. It's capturing tensions you observe, your own position, your responses. And usually it goes through different levels, yeah? So it is difficult to take notes. It's not a very fun exercise. You'll see that because you're going to do an exercise soon. But basically, you are observing and you're making notes on what you're observing, which seems kind of boring, right? Because why, if you see it, why do it again in terms of notes? It's because you forget very quickly what you saw. And usually in the space, in the field, you don't have time to extensively write out a novel. So you're just doing quick notes, which are called raw notes. And then you're usually at the end of the day, or maybe after a few days, you're fleshing them out into more detailed descriptions. And you're already starting to make some notes in the margins, yeah? And this process from going from random notes to organizing notes to putting them under headings and eventually developing an ethnography. So on the right-hand side, you just see some very rough notes from an ethnography conducted in a surgical theater. And you can see that the person uses abbreviations, they're using some symbols, they're using some diagrams just to quickly capture what they saw, right? So what is it you take notes on? Often you're noting details of appearance, behavior, physical interactions. You're looking at what's going on during your visit. You might capture some of the conversation or the exchanges, and you might be taking notes on what you find unexpected or surprising. So the initial notes tend to be descriptive, okay, which means you're just describing what you see. So often there's description of the physical environment. Okay, this is just a small extract from field notes that were taken by a colleague, Professor Seeley, and this was in Uganda many, many years ago. So she's describing the interior of a small hut in a rural part of Uganda, and this was in context of a study on HIV and aging. Okay, so she's describing what she sees, right? The next step is kind of moving from the descriptive to the analytical, because as you take more and more notes, imagine you go back and you're visiting a number of households in the area and you're trying to manage how older people who have HIV are managing their duties as grandparents or whatever it is, and at the same time managing their medication, staying on long-term medication. So after you have conducted your preliminary field work, you've visited a few households, you've had a few informal chats, you're moving to a more analytical conception. You're getting a sense of what might be the coping strategies, what might be the household division of labor, what are older people doing, you know, what roles do they have, and how does illness affect their day-to-day experiences, their roles, etc. So you're moving to more interpretation. So your notes are becoming more analytical, and your notes are starting to generate some hypotheses or mini theories. So let's take this example, yeah? We want to conduct field work in a support group for people living with some condition, okay? This is somewhere in a European country, and there's a lot of peer support groups that are set up in rich countries for all kinds of conditions. So let's say this is a group of people that are living with something called chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a condition, right? Now, let's say you've been granted access, you've spoken to the people, you have ethical permission, and you are going to do 6 weeks of field work. And that field work is going to entail interacting, taking part, but you're going to be sitting somewhere behind. You might be sitting, maybe there's a field worker hiding behind that tree. But essentially, you're going to position yourself in an unobtrusive way, and you're going to listen to what happens in these support groups. That's your main entry point. You might have individual interviews with different people later who are affected by the condition, or with people who are part of their families. But one piece of work is just attending these support group meetings twice a week. Okay? So in the beginning, you don't know much about what goes on. So what is it you're going to be doing? What do you think you're going to be taking descriptive notes on? What are you going to notice?
The setting of how each and everyone is sitting, and who is facilitating that support group. So generally there's one person who facilitates the discussion. So maybe something around that, and
Okay,
descriptions
good.
around that.
Good. But even before that, purely descriptive, what are you going to be describing?
The number of people in the support.
Exactly. The number of people. What else about the people?
Their age.
Yeah. Gender, how many men, how many women, age, physical characteristics, right? And go ahead.
Yeah, how they are sitting, like the sitting arrangements, what they are wearing, how they are behaving, their expressions.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So the first round of meetings, you're probably still focused on looking at physical characteristics. How is the meeting organized? Structure. Gayatri, you started to talk about. So structure is already moving towards analytical. Yeah. Okay. Now you've attended 4 meetings. What do you think you're going to move towards now? Now you're going to become more analytical.
We can see that which who are interacting, who's not interacting, who's speaking less, who's not speaking, and what are the conflicts between two people, who's opposing the ideas, and all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you're going to start to understand more about the dynamics of this group. Yeah, and you might start to see, you might start to characterize the way people contribute to the group, their tone, their content, their agendas, their motivations, right? And then a third set of notes further down the line, let's say you've had the chance to attend 8 meetings, might be actually how do these, ultimately it is related to your question, which is how do the peer support groups make a difference for people's health and well-being? Because even through observing this group, you're going to notice things about people's level of satisfaction, their contentment, their willingness to speak. And in conjunction with the observations, you will also hear about how they're doing, because they're going to share a lot about their lives. All right, so you can see how spending 6 to 8 weeks in this group will allow you to progressively develop something more theoretical about what is the relevance of peer support groups for people with chronic fatigue syndrome in terms of their health and well-being. And what might be very interesting is that you notice that it's very different for men and women. Or maybe there's people of different nationality, and it seems to be more, like I explained to you in Canada, the difference between what I found for English-speaking versus French-speaking people living with HIV. So, anybody have a clue as to what this is called, moving from purely descriptive through to setting, giving meaning to what I'm seeing and hearing? What is it called in anthropological terms? Okay, it's referred to as thick description. Okay, a thin description is he's wearing a white shirt, blue pants, roughly 55 years old, graying hair. That's a thin description. Thick description is you start to interpret. Because you've been there for a while, this person assumes a prominent leadership role. He does so by asserting himself physically, the way he sits, the way he spreads his body, yeah? You're moving to a thick description by virtue of understanding more and more about the context in order to give meaning to what they say and what they're doing. Okay? So now we go back to the pharmacist. So here is our thin description. The elderly man enters the crowded chemist shop. He asks the pharmacist's assistant on duty for a particular medicine. The assistant hesitates and calls to the back of the shop. And the pharmacist comes to greet the man, nods to the assistant, who goes off, gets the 2 strips of tablets, and hands it to the customer. Okay. A thick description, which means you have been in this pharmacy for a while, and you've observed not only different interactions between older people, younger people, people of different backgrounds, but you've also noticed that this man comes in fairly regularly, this elderly man. So the thicker description could start to look at how is this pharmacy organized spatially? And what does it mean with respect to the division of labor? Okay? How is it organized in terms of material? Is it well organized in contrast to the pharmacy that we saw before on the earlier image, which looked quite chaotic because it was just absolutely stuffed? So what is the organization? And what is the organization of the medicines, the type of medicines, where they're stocked, how people access them? What does it say about the pharmacy itself? We might start looking at procedures and routines. So what is the standard, what happens when somebody enters, who attends to them, and how? We might look at the timing of events. So if 3 people come in at the same time, is any preference given to one person? Do some people take longer? Is more advice given to one person than the other? And we might look at the division of labor. So 2 pharmacists on duty, one is more junior. What's the division of labor there? And we might understand the communication or interaction with the clients based on gender, age, and other verbal and non-verbal indicators. So let's say this person has a very high standing, so high caste, very revered, but also very stern, and commands authority just by the way he comes in, demands the medicine. They don't even bother with the prescription. I mean, I know that's the case anyway for many pharmacies, that you don't really have to ask for a prescription. I mean, you don't have to show a prescription. But there may be quite a lot of not so subtle differences in the way this man is treated than the next person who comes in, who is, in terms of the social status, further down the ranks. So there's obvious markers and symbols of knowledge and skills. Again, the issue of tacit knowledge. Yeah? And the nature of the exchange and transaction. So this is a description of how you can move from thin description, purely describing what you see, to interpretation, which is a thicker description. Okay, we're going to end with some examples of the ways in which ethnography, which always involves some kind of thick description because you have the luxury and you have the time to set things in their context. So we're going to look at ethnography in health research. One example is so-called single-sited ethnographies, where you stay in one site, and there are many different examples of single-sited ethnographies. So one is following, for example, the life or the lives of individuals that are affected by a particular condition. How are they enabled or hindered in their efforts to manage conditions and make use of available services? So a nice example, back in the 90s, there was I think he's still there, a very well-known anthropologist called Vin Kim Nguyen. And he wrote a book about how people living with HIV drew strength from solidarity, from associating themselves with other people with HIV, and forming coalitions, forming groups that became very pertinent in terms of demanding access to treatment. or also just supporting each other in terms of care and solidarity. So movements that were particularly important came up, of course, in the United States, but also in parts of Southern Africa, and he called it therapeutic citizenship. So this idea that people formed a homogeneous group, they became a community that was tied to each other by virtue of sharing this identity in terms of needing access to treatment. Okay? Another example of a single-sited ethnography is the focus on providers and professional socialization. So this is understanding how a particular set of health providers, for example, mid-level managers, for example, CHOs or ASHAs, how are their roles, practices, and working relationships formed? How do they influence the ways in which healthcare is delivered? So there's been a lot of work on nurse-clinician relationships, for example, the acculturation of medical students, or the role of particular lay health workers. So professional socialization means the pathway through which you become a health worker, okay? So this is the nice ethnography that I mentioned to you before. It's called Special Treatment, Student Doctors at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And it is a very solid ethnography of a particular institution that has a very high ranking in the country, that has cultivated a status around studying medicine. And here's the quote from the back of the book. Ruddock untangles the threads of intellectual exceptionalism, social and power stratification, and health inequality that are woven into the healthcare taught and provided at AIMS, asking what is lost when medicine is used not as a social equalizer, but as a means to cultivate and maintain prestige. Okay, now we can argue with her perspective, but she did ethnography for quite some time, interviewing people at different stages, but also interviewing people who never got into AIMS, and understanding the power dynamics around what it meant to get in and to stay in the institution. It's a really, really interesting, I examined her thesis, and I was really impressed because it was, I think you've met her, haven't you, Solomon? You know her, yeah. Okay, so another third aspect of a single-sited ethnography is a focus, we've talked about focus on patients, focus on providers, but also focus on organizations. So you may have heard of the expression institutional ethnography, and this is where you're looking at the institutional as a whole. So this is your kind of meso-level ethnography. How do work activities shape and maintain the institution? How are they connected to other social processes? And this is an example of a hospital ethnography. It's called Wandering the Wards, an ethnography of hospital care and its consequences for people living with dementia. So they're looking at how being institutionalized for a condition impacts on your pathways and your simply your experience of living with the condition. Now, I noticed that this is not only a book, but this has become a podcast. So I'm going to try to find the link for you. It might be very interesting. I'm going to listen into it myself. I think it might be interesting. Okay, now we talked about single-sited ethnography. Now we're going to talk about multi-sited ethnography. So multi-sited is exactly what it sounds like. It means you move around, okay? Because your study, by definition, if I'm looking at PPM, I might have multiple sites. I might want to understand its origins at the international WHO, international organizations. I might want to understand what's happening at the national level, and I might want to go right to the frontline interface, yeah? So it means you follow a topic through different field sites, geographically or socially. So a typical, another example would be if I'm working, for example, I mentioned a project that we've just put in a proposal for about mobile populations. So our ethnography has to be a mobile ethnography because we want to understand how men who stay away from home for occupational reasons, for their livelihood strategies, how they're drawing on different assets at different points. And so that's going to mean going with them and understanding at each point along their trading or trucking route what life is like for them. Yeah. You can explore the movement of commodities. So some people, there's an interesting work that was done in the 90s on the social lives of medicines, where they actually tracked medicines from their production in India to their distribution in Uganda. And along the way, They conducted ethnographies with different actors to understand how the meaning and the value of those antiretroviral drugs was transformed at each step. So that the Indian produced, Cipla produced antiretrovirals, how were they ranked in relation to ones produced by other companies, etc., by the time they got down to the field level. You can also track transnational processes. So this is if by definition your topic means that you need to move around the world or within a country. You might be tracking people who are inherently mobile, or you might be tracking the genesis of an idea. So very often in health policy and systems work, we might be interested in policy transfer, how a policy that was developed in one place is implemented in a number of countries. And it requires really a macro level perspective and understanding of globalization processes. So this is not so much a micro level thing, but the original concept for the ethnography might be a macro level one. Okay, we're going to end. Now you might be saying, look, thank you very much, but I'm not going to do this ethnography business. It sounds too complicated, too long, too much interpretation. I would still say that you can still employ some of the thinking in your work. Essentially, to be a rigorous ethnographer, you do need to conduct field work. You do need some aspect of participant observation. You think about your methods as being more open-ended, more flexible. You triangulate methods. You definitely use thick description, and you have some, a degree of reflection, reflexivity, but positionality. So I still think whatever research you're doing, you can do a number of things. You can ensure that rapport building through learning language, understanding how people do things the way they are doing them, entering into their shoes, okay? So with many of your topic guides, I was saying to you, flip it around. Try that topic guide out on yourself. If you can't understand it, nobody's going to understand it, all right? So always put yourself in those shoes, yeah? The other thing you can do is you can definitely work with more in-depth and flexible methods. You'll be surprised how rich some of that data can be. Even if you can only do 1 day of observation in a health center, or you can accompany one Asha in her work, or you can see a day in the life of somebody, it's going to be so rich than rather not doing it at all. And any kind of analysis, bear this in mind, that you're moving through levels of interpretation. If you have a relatively short time, you might not be able to do that really thick description, but you're going to be still offering something about interpreting a situation in context. So all of you, when you looked at the transcript from the South African clinic, were at different levels of description, analysis. And I think one table was quite strong in terms of already moving forward in terms of analytical categories, okay? The disadvantage is they were only looking at one transcript, so maybe they were over hasty with those categorizations, all right? Okay, so don't worry about this homework. This is related to a paper which is a very interesting paper on maternal wards in Bihar. But I think we're going to see how you get on this afternoon. We've got another session on observation, and we're actually going to ask you to conduct an observation, so that may be plenty. I will put this paper up for you on the Moodle, or Sakshi will do that, and it can be an optional task that you do if you want to do more reading, okay? Because some people complain, you didn't give us enough papers, we didn't do enough reading, so I want to make sure that's not the case, okay? So we'll stop there.